We looked last week at Israel's, or God's, I guess, plan for the Israelites, the Israel nation, as they are preparing to enter in to conquer the Promised Land. And there were some conditions and things that God had directed Joshua to tell the people. And we looked at some of the responsibilities that God had given them. We looked at some of how the nations, of course, Manasseh and it just slipped my mind. Reuben and Gad had been able to kind of set up camp and maybe weren't going to go in to the Promised Land. Is it not working? I'm going to turn that down too so that it is. I don't know why it would be up for. Oh, okay. How they had set up camp and God had allowed them to do so. But yet, even though God had allowed them to do that, they still needed to be a part of the conquering of the Promised Land. All right, so the mighty men there, some of the good warriors, were going to be a part of the conquest because they had an obligation to do so. About 40,000 of the troops there, or soldiers, I guess, from Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh. There were a total of about 137,000. 40,000 of them were involved in the crossing over of that. So that's what we looked at last week, and we stopped right there in verse number 14 with God describing the responsibilities of the nations to go in and conquer the land, and why that was important, because God is going to use the Israelites to show His glory, to show dominion over all creation. Right? That's essentially what this is about. So that brings us to verse number 15. And in verse number 15 of chapter 1, God promises something else. So He's given them responsibilities, and He's talked about what He's asked, or what He's going to require of them. But He's also promised some things as well. In verse 15, we see Him promising national rest, right? So the tribes that were from the east, that were participating in the conquest, were required to do so until the other tribes, right? So the other 10.5 or 9.5 tribes took possession of the land and rested. What was going on here? Verse 15, right? Until the Lord hath given your brethren rest, as He hath given you, and they also have possessed the land which the Lord your God hath given them. Then ye shall return unto the land your possession, and enjoy it, which Moses, the Lord's servant, gave you on the side of Jordan towards the sunrise. So on the east side there. So He's promising them that if they do this, right, they will in fact have rest when they get to kind of conquer the entirety of the land there. The emphasis here for this, right, the emphasis in verse 15 specifically is the instruction from Joshua about God doing what to the land. What's God going to do to the land, to the Israelites? Especially there in verse 15, right? Possess the land which the Lord your God hath done what? Right? Giveth to them. Has given them, right? So there's an emphasis on the fact that God had given them this land, and the land was there for Israel's enjoyment, because Israel's enjoyment of God giving them the land, all of those things were a glory to God, right? The land was theirs to take. It was theirs to enjoy to the fullest, but neither of those things are going to happen if all the tribes didn't take the step of faith here to enter the land to possess it. Okay, so that's the promise and rest, promising them the ability to take it over. They just had to step out on faith and do that, right? That's the thing here that needs to happen for the Israelites. Participation in possessing the land
would have affected Israel's faith to grow stronger, right? Because they are going to, would have more if they would have done what they're supposed to, but they are going to demonstrate demonstrate and see God's attributes in like a real world time, right? They're going to see His faithfulness and His holiness and His power. And like they're going to see it in real world time take place, right? As we get into this in a little bit, we know that the first battle here is what? What is the first conquest of the Israelites in a couple chapters, maybe next chapter? Jericho, right? The Battle of Jericho is kind of the first thing. And we know the story, right? The instructions. Were they supposed to go in with their swords and their spears and try to conquer Jericho? They weren't, right? God told them to do what? Just parade around, right? Just parade around. And the Israelites, as we will see, did exactly as God had required. And what happened to Jericho? The stuff just started falling down, right? One would think, after experiencing that supernatural phenomena, right, of God just destroying those things. And there's archaeological proof that Jericho had the tallest towers in the land of Canaan at that time. They found proof of these eastern towers, these quarterly towers. Like it was enormously the stuff that was built there. Unlike anything sand, we know the walls were thick enough to drive chariots, but they found like archaeological evidence of these things. It seems to me, right, that should have been enough information, like visual seeing God work, that they should have just gone in and done what they're supposed to do. Of course, we know that they did not. If they would have, we would have seen faith continuing to grow, witnessing God demonstrating His great power on display. That's coming later. I don't know why I got off on that, but had God simply just given the promised land to the Israelites, right? God has the ability to do that. He could have just given it to them. He could have just wiped all those people out with one word, right? I didn't even say anything, and waved His hand, right? However you want to consider it. If He just simply given it to them, would they have appreciated it? No, right? Absolutely not. They would not have appreciated it. Because if they had to, this is a parental lesson, right? Or just any lesson for all of us. We tend to take care of more things that we have paid for, that we have worked for, right? That we have taken care of. It's always amazing to me, right? As being a high school teacher. And I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong. That's not the point of this. But to see when those kids start driving cars, right? When they get 16, 17 or whatever, and they finally get to where they're driving to school instead of having to ride the old cheese wagon to school every day, you can most of the time tell the kids who have been given either like a brand new car or something to drive, and those who have had to maybe take a job on or work on the summer a little bit, right, to help mom and dad pay for the insurance or help the car pay, whatever the case may be, because you can just watch them pull out of the parking lot a lot of times and tell, I bet that one right there ain't paid a dime for that vehicle, right? Because they don't care the way they treat them. They're zipping around and pulling out in front of the bus, and tires are squealing and smoke, just diesel fuel just flying out of the back, and you can tell like this. Most of the time, there's some kid who's very cautious, making sure that he's taken care of because they value that more because they have put some cost, some sacrifice into it, right? That's you can tell. Same concept here, right? This is a very good teaching lesson, like for young parents, right? Because God didn't just give it to them. He made them work for it a little bit because they would have valued it more. If He would have just handed it over to them, handing the keys of the kingdom, they would have maybe at first initially been pretty thankful for it, right? But there would have been, probably not the care or concern or the care for the resources of it. So He wanted them to fully enjoy it, but He also wanted them to appreciate working to get to it as well, right? The faith would have been much more shallow if He would have just handed things over to them. God wisely chose to have all the tribes, including those on the east of Jordan, to participate in the conquest, increase their faith in Him,
further appreciation for the enjoyment of the land, both would have been greatly enhanced, right? And in turn, God's glory would have been magnified more. Go ahead, Jack. All right, second thing here, verses 16, 17, and 18, where it was now God's told the requirements here, right? He's given the responsibilities. And now we have Israel's pledge to God, right? 4 things here in this pledge. The first one is, as you can see, all the tribes here are making a promise to obey. Leaving behind their inheritances, setting aside the desire to enjoy the land immediately. The tribes from the east of Jordan made the commitment and made the promise to obey all that Joshua had commanded them, which in turn had come from the Lord, right? They even go so far as to say, as we'll see here in verse 16, that they would do whatever Joshua commanded, and then they would go wherever he commanded them to go. These men are completely willing to fully serve him. And this is more than likely the sentiment that is echoing through all of the conquesting tribes here, right? They're probably all echoing the same sentiment, because as we see in verse 16, they used the pronoun, and they answered Joshua, saying, all that thou commandest us we will do, and whithersoever thou sendest us we will go. So the they pronoun that is there is a plural pronoun, right? And it refers to probably all of the officers, right? Remember last week we talked about Israel had this chain of communication set up where the officers, kind of the leaders, would come to Joshua. Joshua would tell them the news or the marching orders or whatever needed to be distributed. Those officers would go back to the tribes, and that's how they got information out, right? So this is probably the officers of all these tribes telling Joshua, like, wherever you tell us to go, that's where we'll go. Whatever you tell us to do, that's what we'll do. And that was all of them, full encompassing all of them there. They promise to listen to Joshua's leadership, right? And they said that they would heed him just like they had heeded Moses. Look at verse 17. According to as we hearken unto Moses in all things, so we will hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses. All right, so they're going to give him loyalty, recognize him as their leader. God appointed leader here, that the commandments that he was giving them came from the Lord, just like Moses' commandments came from the Lord. Not going to be suspicious of Joshua in any way, not try to undermine or usurp his authority in any way. Like, is everybody fired up right before first quarter? Right, everybody's ready to go? And get the battle, the pregame speech, whatever. Everybody's focused on the same thing. I'm going to follow Joshua, and wherever he leads, they will go. Whatever he tells them to do, they will do. So everybody's on board here, right? Everybody's ready to go fight, take this place over, go win the battle. And that's where we're at. So that's the promise. We see that. We see them telling Joshua, whatever you say, we'll do. Wherever you go, we'll go. Okay? We expect the commandments that are coming from you, that are coming from God. It's important for us to remember that. Might want to circle a little verse 16 and 17 there, because we're going to probably, I would imagine at some point, we're going to revisit this. Okay, what they promised here. All right, verse 17, second part of this, the tribes here also had said a prayer, or we did say a prayer for Joshua. According as we have hearkened Moses in all things, so we hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses. All right, so the tribes step further, requested here that the Lord be with Joshua, just like they had been with just like he had been with Moses. Okay, give me 3 words that describe God's presence with Moses. Up until this point, give me 3 descriptive words here, adjectives, that describes God's relationship with Moses, or presence with Moses. Obvious, perfect. Consistent. Give me one more. Personal. Okay. Obvious, personal, and consistent. Really good words. Very good descriptive words of God's presence with Moses. I wrote down faithful, powerful. I'd also have written down personal and gracious. Right? Those are all things that God displayed with Moses. God's presence now is going to make all the difference in Joshua's life as well, just like it had with Moses, right? Israel realizes that, and they realize that God's presence with Joshua makes all the difference, that they come to an understanding of that, and they want to be successful as possible, so they want Joshua to be successful as possible, because he's the one that's getting information from God, right? He's the leader, so it's important for them to listen to what Joshua says, just like they had listened to Moses, and that the success was intertwined, essentially. Joshua was battle smart, he was wise, he was strong, but none of those skills would be adequate by themselves to take over the promised land, right? So for the people here, praying that God would be with Joshua while this was going on was also a way of reminding him, Joshua, that he needed God's presence as well, right? And that it was important that he relied on God as well. So this is kind of a reminder to Joshua from the people here that, hey, make sure you're with the Lord just like Moses was. Make sure you're obedient to God just like Moses was, because you're the guy that's leading us through this, right? We want you to be intertwined as much as possible in your relationship with God. The people were at the mercy of their leader, right? That's the way this goes. So if Joshua goes and makes the conquest all about himself, which he could have, he doesn't, he could have, right? Then the whole thing is going to be disastrous. So this is a reminder to the leader that, hey, yeah, we're following you. We want you to be with God. Okay? Who usually gets the glory when a leader is keenly aware of God's leading and his power? God does, right? Absolutely. So what would you predict for the success of a leader who is self-reliant? Failure. Misery. You are a lot tougher than I was on this. All right. So that leader will define success as anything that makes himself look good. Okay? And therefore determine his actions based on his ego rather than God's glory. All right? And those things don't work out. Verse 18 here, we see the tribes rehearse the penalty for rebellion. So we know here, rebellion would be not listening to Joshua and God, right? So they're going to rehearse here the penalty of that. Verse 18, whosoever he be that doth rebel against thy commandment, and not listen to the word, right? Not hearken unto the words in all that commandest him. What is the consequence? The next thing say, he shall be what? Okay. So, let's just be aware, right? I think it's important for us to be aware as we begin to progress through this conquest that the people of the tribes, the people of Israel, right? The people that are going to be doing the conquesting, led by Joshua, of course, but the people who are going through and actually doing the conquest, they have said, there's evidence of it here. We're going to listen to Joshua, do whatever he says, because we know that his direction comes from God. Doesn't matter what it is, we'll do it. On the opposite side of that, if we don't do it, right, if we begin to rebel and don't listen to what Joshua and God say, then we're going to do what? We're going to make sure those people who rebel are dead. We're going to put them to death. We're going to snuff out the rebellion. Okay? That's what they're saying here. All right? I think it's going to be very important for us to remember verses 16 through 18 of chapter 1 as we begin to move through the book of Joshua here, right? So the consequence for rebellion was death. All the tribes are going to agree here that whoever disobeys were to be put to death. Now, this seems kind of harsh, right? But we got to remember that Joshua is about to lead Israel into battle. Right? This isn't like a blueberry picking festival they're going to go
cross, right? There are, I don't know why I said that's the first thing that came to mind. This is a battle, right, that's going to happen. It's war, fights, stuff, giants, civilizations that are powerful, okay? They didn't want to have any type of any regrets or any whisperings of rebellion going on in the army whatsoever. So, how strictly would you expect generals to treat their soldiers while on the battlefront? What would the generals expect of their soldiers while on the battlefront? Obedience, right? Go this way or flank whatever, right? And then no questions asked, just go. If that's not happening, then there's problems, right? We understand. We're well aware of what rebellion can happen to individuals, especially in an army, in the middle of a fight, right? So obeying Joshua here is a life and death situation. Militarily, for sure, right? Because when people start leaving the front lines, it's going to be a problem. But it's also life and death spiritually. Israel is about to embark on a completely new journey. They had never seen anything like this before. This was not like walking around in the wilderness for 40 years. This is not that at all, right? This is completely different. They were to have this land for the very first time as their own in all of their history. So it's important for them to understand the seriousness of rebellion and the seriousness of obeying God as they conquest through the promised land. Joshua chapter 7, we know that the story of Achan, right? Achan tried to test God's faithfulness. And in lesson number 7, when we get there, God has to punish Israel's disobedience. And Achan, what was the result of Achan's rebellion? Do you remember in chapter 7? Maybe you don't. We'll get there. But he dies, right? He has to be, he lost his life as a result of his rebellion. A similar event happened at the beginning of the church there, right, with Ananias and Sapphira. Right? We know that story as well. They lied to who? Holy Spirit, right? And lied about their giving. And in Acts chapter 5, they lied about their giving, and God did what? On the spot, right? Dead on the spot for their sins. God expects great respect, right? And when that moment of Ananias and Sapphira, them dying, that happened, the result of that was great respect for the church. Achan's sin that happens in chapter 7 resulted in a heap of stones in the valley of Achor. That's over in chapter 7, verse 26. That pile of stones that was there was an ongoing reminder to Israel to respectfully fear God. Okay? So that's the penalty for rebellion here in verse 18. All right? And then we see finally here their plea to their leader as this finishes up. So the tribes are ending their message here, or their response to Joshua, with a plea, right? Verse 18, the last part of that, he should be put to death. And then the plea here is, only be strong and of good courage, right? That's the plea to Joshua. Hey, this is what we're promising. Any rebellion going on, we'll make sure they're put to death. Putting our faith in you, because in God, of course. So be strong, be of good courage. They're ready to move forward. They're ready to start this conquest. The sinfulness of refusing to step into the land, they understood the consequence of that. So they are essentially saying, Joshua, lead us to the promised land. Be strong, be of good courage. We're pleading now that you lead us into the promised land. This plea here of the Israelites to have Joshua lead them was a very, very essentially spiritual decision, right? Because this shows them stepping out on faith. Putting their faith in God and then trusting Him to give them the promised land just as He said that He would. This attitude of them, everybody being ready to go, this was what was missing 40 years previously when Moses and them showed up and they didn't want to go in, right? We know that story, right? Showed up there and Moses sent in
the 12 spies to see what was going on. And of course, 2 of them came back and said, "Hey, let's ready. It looks great. Let's go." 10 of them said no. They were lacking this spiritual decision to faithfully allow God to take them over. That was over in Numbers 13. And because that generation that said no died, right? That's what's happened here. That generation denied that they had the strength and the courage to enter the promised land, and therefore they didn't make it into the promised land. Their graves, the death of that generation that didn't go in, their graves are a serious illustration that entrance into the promised land was not an option. It wasn't a choice, right? This is a non-negotiable. If this bunch said no, God probably would have went 40 more years, and then maybe the next generation, maybe that wouldn't. Probably would have happened. Okay. But the ones that said no, their graves were an illustration for how serious this was. We could say for Israel to deny God the opportunity to give the promised land to them was in fact a grave miscalculation. In the new generation, this land was a gift that they had to open, or I guess metaphorically, they would explode in their hands. For the new generation to refuse to enter the land would have been an even bigger sin than their parents committed when they refused to enter the land of promise. So Joshua was concerned about how these new tribes of Israel were going to influence each other. If the tribes here that were in the east had decided to not to go in and to stay out of the promised land, they would have probably discouraged or threatened to discourage the other tribes from coming in and entering as well. If none of the Israelites had decided to go and enter into the promised land, then they would have robbed God of yet another opportunity to reflect His glory. So this threat here to God's glory was why both Moses and Joshua confronted the tribe on the east of the Jordan River so strongly to make sure they understood the importance of why they had to go in and take over the promised land. Now the people are ready. We see them spiritually, mentally, physically being in a place to be prepared, and they have told Joshua to lead them. Go ahead, Chad. So, the glory of God is at stake here in verses 10 through 18. As we can see, Israel's first opportunity, we see that nobody entered into the land. And after Israel said no, God then responded, "And as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." So now we're at this point, right? We're over here, little Stickman or whatever, Canaan, Gilead or whatever. It's a crossroads, second opportunity to enter the land. And now we see the Israelites standing there not saying no anymore, but saying, "We will do whatever you tell us, and we will go wherever you send us." Go ahead, Chad, bring up that last thing. So this then prepares us essentially for chapter number 2, that we begin to see the first conquest here in chapter 2, which is Jericho. All right, so God's faithfulness is worthy of glory. And so just to put this in historical context for us, right? And this is, I would like for somebody to do a movie on the conquest of the Israelites. I think it would be cool. It would be very brutal as well. But this is so essentially I don't set the scene here, but banks of the Jordan River. Joshua's standing there. The sun is kind of going down behind him. Joshua's standing there, maybe looking up into the sky, having a conversation with God, and then as the scene closes, all these people with all their swords walk up behind, and Joshua looks over to his left right-hand man, and they just kind of give the head nod, and we're ready to go, right? That's how chapter 1 ends. They're prepared to go into the promised land. Everybody's feeling good. Right? Everybody's happy. Everybody's fired up. Their faithfulness, obedience is at the peak right here. They're expecting God to do great things, expecting to
probably unsure of what's getting ready to happen, but don't really care. I think God's going to take over everything. And then we jump into chapter 2, and like God does something amazing, right? That's exactly what happens here as we get into this event of the walls of Jericho coming down. So that's what we'll get into next week. Starting there in chapter 2, we see spies again going in. We have Rahab here, who becomes a very important person. Of course, we know the story of Rahab, and then the spies responding to God, and then we'll start working through here as we see this conquesting here throughout the book of Joshua. We kind of move through all these things that are happening. I had been reading through the lessons here, like I had kind of forgot like some of the cool stuff that happens in Joshua. Like there is some really interesting things that take place here in Joshua. I had I guess it's been a long time since I'd read it or looked at it. Kind of interesting to see, but we'll get to that next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson. We thank you, Lord, for the faithfulness that is on display here in chapter 1 and how you honor it. Chapters 2 and 3, and the importance for us to understand that obedience to you is the requirement. There is no alternative. Blessings will follow. It's the desire, Lord, it should be required of us. We should understand that you've been faithful to us over and over and over and over again, Lord. So we need to be return faithful to you in our obedience, Lord, and then let you take care of everything else. And that should be the desire of our hearts, Lord. And I pray as we continue to move through this book of Joshua and see the Israelites in a variety of different predicaments and situations, and the response of those things, Lord, that we learn total obedience to you is the best and most purest way to live, Lord. I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes here too in the next little bit. We have our service today and then again this afternoon. That you'll use him in a mighty way. Keep us attentive to your word this morning as well. In your name, I pray.